Um, Ready to begin? We're going to look at Razor pages. We're going to look at two examples today. We're going to look at the one example that I had kind of a funky version of last week. That was an example I did a long time ago, and I was just learning Razor pages myself, and I did something kind of goofy, and so I simplified it quite a bit now that I'm more familiar with the process. Let's see, what else? I told my morning class, which I think you guys are in, that I felt like maybe I'm having an off day, and I totally blew one choice in Wordle. And it was like I must be having a bad day because I played the same two letters in the exact two spots that it told me a minute ago that they weren't in. So, oh well, hopefully we'll make it through the day. All right, the first example I'm going to look at is I'm going to look at the temperature conversion. So we'll open this up. And we'll show you how it acts, and then we'll see the changes I made. The functionality of it I really didn't change from last time, but just to refresh your memory. Well, that's not us. Okay. This has the temperature in centigrade that you have to enter in. And you enter in the temperature, click go, and it tells you what it is in Fahrenheit. All right. Let's look at the code and review what I changed to make it work a little better, and maybe talk a minute about why I think it's better this way. The CSS_HTML, I got rid of all the code. You can put code in your CSS_HTML file, but it's my humble belief that it's better to have all the code in the model. Then you're just pulling things from the model into your CSS_HTML. That doesn't mean never put any code in. You know, I think in this upcoming example, we're going to end up putting a little bit of code in the CSS_HTML. So, you know, take it with a grain of salt to say that it's probably good where you can. We'll put that caveat on there. If you have a choice of where to put it in the model. And here I had a choice where to put it. And what I did is changed the model. If you remember before, in the CSS_HTML, I was actually testing to see if the button was pressed in the CSS_HTML, because we had to distinguish between the first time the page loaded and each subsequent time. All right. So therefore, I put an if statement in there to check to see if the button was pressed. Here I did it better. Essentially, we have a results on this page when we run it. And we want to show those results when the user has entered the data and pressed submit, but we don't want to show them on the initial load. Well, we can differentiate between those two activities. The first time it loads versus the submit button is pressed. And we can do that based on whether it's a GET request or a POST request. Now we talked a little bit about this in all the classes, I think, and it may still be a little bit fuzzy. Let me try to clarify it, and we'll see if you have any questions. There's essentially two ways to request a page. There's a GET request, and there's a POST request. The GET request doesn't have any form data as part of the request. The form data is part of the URL. All right, so the data that's being passed, any data that would be being passed to it would be passed via the URL. The GET request is also what happens to be the kind of request that you're going to get when you initially load the page. Right? So therefore, on GET is going to assume it's the first time the page is loading. On POST then is after we have entered the data and click the submit button. How do we know it's on POST? Because I have a method of POST for that. If anything, that's a good reason to use a method of POST, so you can differentiate between the first time it loads and each subsequent time. We're going to see a little bug, I think, when I open up the HiLo game, which is the second example today. And again, solving it is going to depend on knowing whether this is the first time the page loads or if it's a subsequent time. So, if the first time the page loads, the onGet gets called, and I simply initialize the result as being nothing. If, however, that a valid piece of data is entered, let me rephrase that. If a piece of data is entered, we haven't done anything with valid data yet. If a piece of data is entered, then, and they've clicked the submit button and it's a non-post, we do this routine, which grabs the value temperature from the text box, all right, which is passed in the form collection under the name temp.c. Name temp.c. We do the calculation, and then I form the result string. In either case, I simply output the result right here. All right. Any questions about that? Now, a couple of things. Let's see if you can open up your crystal ball. What's going to happen if I don't enter a number in? Any predictions? No, it's going to assume if I declared an int variable, it would, I believe it assumes 0. But if I do this, since this is not a number, this is a string, an empty string is valid. So it's going to try to convert. Well, we'll test if you enter nothing in, because you might be right on that. We'll test an empty string, and we'll test if you put a garbage string in to see what happens. So let's run this. And let's put nothing in there. Ah, it blew up. It's giving me an exception on this line. It says convert to double request form temp. All right. So it blew up and it gives us this exception. By the way that ASP.NET applications are configured There's two different kinds of error messages depending on whether you're in development mode or whether you're in production mode, whether this is actually a live website or if you are the developer working on this. This is a detailed report, a detailed error report, and it only would be visible if you're in development mode. I think we looked at it last time to see, depending on the kind of mode you were in, you can set it and you can say you're in development or in production mode, and it will use a different error message. The different error message is because it's possible sometimes through error messages to give, to compromise the system by giving more information than you should in an error message. As a developer, you want an explicit error message. As a security person, you want the error message given to customers to be user-friendly and not giving away any information. So if there's nothing in there, we get an error. Likewise, we type something that's not a number, we're going to get the same error. How can we handle this? There's a couple ways you can handle this. So we're going to put what in a try-catch block? Yeah, I guess that was kind of a dumb question. Not to make excuses for myself, but what I meant was, do we put just one specific line or do we put all of them? And really, this is probably the only line that's prone to fail, right? Because it's accepting some user input, and never trust user input. Always validate it one way or another. Now, what I thought someone might say is have an if statement to check to make sure it's numeric. You probably could do that, but exceptions, that's what exceptions are for. Try it and catch the error, all right? That's as good as preventing the error from even being trying to process. In both cases, you get the same result. I'm gonna double check my syntax because I don't trust myself today. I think that's right, but I have a sneaking suspicion I might be forgetting something. Try. Oh, no, looks correct. I'm catching all exceptions here. Is that a good idea? In this case, it's not a bad idea because about the only thing that can go wrong, as I mentioned before, is this line. And the only reason that's going to go wrong is if there's an invalid piece of data. All right. So it doesn't really matter that I'm catching exceptions. It's a good idea when you look at your code to sort of analyze, like what could go wrong here? What could go as unexpected? So these lines are kind of off the hook. All right. Nothing you can do. If you give temp C a valid value, these two things are going to work out fine. So the only thing that could go wrong is that they're not getting a valid value from the form. What are we going to do in case of exception? What's going to be in the catch block? Well, isn't the result equal to cannot process invalid data. So now when we run this, we try to enter something bogus, we get an exception. Cannot process invalid data entered. Right? Here's another question for you. How do I want to say this? How many things would you test to make sure this is okay? How many test cases would you run to make sure this worked? I just went here and I just typed a few things in. All right. 0 centigrade is 32 degrees. 100 centigrade should be 212. I enter garbage in. I get the error message. I enter an empty string. I get the message. I would suggest that you need at least 3 or 4 test conditions here. All right. If you test one temperature and you get that correct, you could have a totally wild, incorrect formula that just happens to work out for that. For example, -40. -40 centigrade is equal to -40 Fahrenheit. It is. But your formula could be Fahrenheit equals the value of centigrade. That could be your whole formula. And it would work for -40 if that was the only thing you test. So test a few valid values and test a few invalid values. All right. I would say there's a possibility that an empty string could be handled differently than other data, other bad data. So I would test both of those. So I would probably test like 4, hold up 3 fingers and saying 4. I'd probably test 4 different things to make sure that this worked. Testing is important, and it will become more important as we do this class. One big issue I see among students, and in fact, I saw it when I worked as a software developer, is inadequate testing. All right. I know you want to get done with your assignments. You know, people want to get done writing their programs, so go to the next challenge. But you want to make sure what you do is correct. And making just a single test isn't going to be correct. All right. So, granted, it's a little harder when we get like into rock, paper, scissors to test the randomness. But you should not just test for rock, see that the rock worked, and say, I'm done. All right. You should also test paper and scissors. And ideally, you should try to get all 9 results. You know, where rock, 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 paper, rock, scissors, paper, rock, paper, you know the rest of the way. Ideally, you would come across all those possibilities and then see if there's any way to enter invalid data would be the last thing to check. All right. Any questions about this? Let's go on to the HiLo game. The HiLo game is sort of meant to be for little kids to play. It's not a terribly exciting game. But the HiLo game is like this. You have 2 dice and you roll them. All right. What are the possible numbers that you can get with 2 dice? You can get 2 through 12. All right. If you get 2 1s, it's 2. If you get 2 6s, it's 12. This is assuming 6-sided dice. 6-sided dice. All right. Now, is each number as likely? Is it likely to get a 2 as it is to get a 7? No, it isn't. All right. Why? Because there's only one combination of those two dice. There's only one combination of the 36 possible combinations, 6 times 6, that gives you a 2. There is, however, 6 combinations of those two dice that give you a 7. So 7 is the most common number rolled. And if you do analysis like that, you see a nice little bell curve. You know, there's 1 and 6, or 1 and 6, 2 and 5, 3 and 4, 4 and 3, 5 and 2, 6 and 1. You know, where you have the first dice and the second dice. So this game allows you to bet what it's going to be. And your choices are, it's going to be high, which is 8 through 12. It's going to be low, which is 1 through 6, or it's going to be 7 exact. Now, the game pays out 4 to 1 if you pick 7. The game pays out 1 to 1 if you pick either high or low, which actually the odds are against you, right? If you think about it, because there's slightly less than half of the possibilities are low, slightly less than half the possibilities are high, and yet you're getting paid as though it was even money. There's a 1 out of 6 chance to roll a 7, and you're getting paid 4 to 1. So they're getting you there too. All right. All right, let's roll and let's see what we have here. All right, I added another game, another thing here. I kept the default. Notice how the default of just a few versions ago looks terrible. It looks a lot different than like probably the default Razor pages you had. All right, so I have a balance of 100. Actually, I must have fixed this bug, the bug that I described, because previously when I ran this, I had 2 broken images here the first time you run it. So let's pick low. I rolled an 8. Okay, I lost my 1. Let's pick 7. Let's pick high. And this is why you don't gamble, right? Because the odds are stacked against you. All right. If you play this long enough, you know, you will see that if you get the right number. But you know what? If I'm testing this, I probably want to make sure that that happens, even though it's random. So I wouldn't think it would be too hard to get, there I go. I won because I picked low. Excellent. Let's pick high. I won because I picked high. Cool. I picked 7. And there we go. Oh, oh shoot. Thought I had it. I have seen cases of when it's probability based, or whether it's based on some unusual circumstances that you can't recreate. Like, how do you test that your database is crashed? You might be able to figure out a way to do that, but maybe not. Sometimes I've seen people to do error testing hard code things in their program, but you better be sure to remove them later on. You know, they'll return a status that wasn't actually returned just to test, or like disk full, if you're going to test that. Maybe something happens when the disk is full. Well, to test that, you would have to either fill up your disk, which is probably not a good idea, or simulate it by rigging the deck and setting the status to that. Okay, anyhow, let's look at this. We'll start looking at the CISS HTML page. And then we'll look at the CSS243 page. I'm happy there's not a lot of garbage. There's not garbage code in this one. I was holding my breath for a second, making sure I didn't. All right, and what do I mean by garbage code? I mean things that could have been in the model. All right. So we have all this stuff. Model. The title of the page. I have a model tag there. That comes from the model, obviously, because it says model. I did just to demonstrate the fact that you can set a lot of things in the model and then use them in the Razor page itself. So I have a variable called tag in there. And if I set that tag to H1 or H3 or whatever tag I set, I can use a value from the model to create an HTML tag. But you think about it, it's pretty nifty. All right, pretty nifty. Or you can pull something from the model to create part of an HTML tag, which is also pretty cool. So you can use stuff from the model to fill in blanks that are left in this page. All right. So I have my drop down. I have this, which is a hidden field, a hidden form field. We probably have never seen a hidden form field before, pardon the pun. All right. We probably have never used a hidden form field before. The purpose of a hidden form field is to hold some data that's going to get passed from page to page. All right. For example, the balance of the game. All right. You started out when you first go to this page of having 100 points. As you play, you get points added, you get points deducted. Somewhere we have to keep track of what the current balance is so that we can add or subtract points from that after we get the results of the next round that was played. So we could put it in a text box. There's our text box that has our balance. I can pick 7, play. I go down to 99. Notice how the value in the text box changes in that. Problem is I could, cheat and type in whatever number I wanted, all right, because it's a text box. On the other hand, if it's hidden, it works just like a text box. That is, the value will be passed to the server. All right. So it can be used by the server in calculating the new balance. All right. So this holds the old balance. The server calculates the new balance. We put it in a hidden field because we really don't want the user to be able to manipulate it. Okay. I have my submit button. Form method is also to post. There's the balance. I have this results. Notice what the class of the results is. The class of the results comes from the model. All right, this is another case of sort of the power of this what do I want to call it? This model, all right, is that any place in the CSS243 page that we want to pop in a value from that's calculated or determined somehow from the model, we can do that. In this case, we're putting the class there. What do you think I'm doing with the class there? What's the significance of that? I only did it with this one area. Well, let's look at our CSS file. Maybe that'll give us a cue. Blue. I have two classes. One for the first time through, which is first time. One for whether it's a post back, and then I have post back. So the model is based on what the model observes. It's setting that class. It's setting that property in the model, which is used to set the class of that div or whatever it is to either first time or post back. So every time we run this, the model gives a value to result class, and this section gets set the class that the model decides. So here's the results. User selected at user choice. The image of die 1 is images, model, image 1 at image 2. And then finally, I have the numeric values of the two dice, D1 and D2. And then I display the results, which are set. All of those things you're going to see are set in the postback. All the results are going to be set in the postback, along with the class that enables us to see that section of the page. So let's look at the model. Model has all these properties in it. User choice. The value of dice 1, the value of dice 2. A string for the results. A string for the first image. A string for the second image. A string for the results class that we initialize the first time. All right? We'll see what the significance of that is in a minute. My tag is H1. So unless we change it, it's going to say it's going to use an H1 for the results. And then finally, my balance is initialized to 100. So we then have this on post code, which has all this stuff in it for what happens when we get a post. When the page is posted back to. In other words, when the user clicks the submit button. We don't do anything on get, all right, because we've initialized that through our variable declarations. All right, we grab the user choice from the form collection. All right, interesting thing. User choice is a drop down, right? Could we use radio buttons for this? Sure. You could have a radio button for high, low, and 7, or high, 7, and low. All right. When we've submitted that data, all that we submit is the value of that control. So if I called my radio button having a name of user choice, or if I call my dropdown having the name user choice, I would not have to change this code at all. Because when the values are submitted to the server has no idea where those values came from. Right? Could be from a text box for all we know. All right? Or it could be a dropdown, or it could be radio buttons or whatever. All right? It could be a text area. All right? But certainly text, radio buttons and dropdown are the two ones that you would want to use in this case. But that's what that's saying. Request form is saying, give me the thing that came as part of the form that was submitted that has a name of user choice. And that is the name of the dropdown. Balance convert to int 32, request form balance. Request form balance is what? It is the value of that hidden field. One thing I tried to get across with this example is you can use values in the model like anywhere in your CSS_HTML. Here we're using it as a value of this hidden field. Up here we're using it as the tag itself, and so on down the line. All right. So we have the balance, we have the user choice. We generate a random number, or we create a random object to generate a random number. We create a random number between 1 and 7, not inclusive. So in other words, you're going to get a value 1 through 6. All right. And then I have a bunch of just simple if statements. You could use a case statement if you wanted to. Nothing too exciting. If the user choice is low and the total is less than 7, then they won and their balance gets incremented. If it's low and the sum of the two is not less than 7, they've lost and the balance gets decremented. Same thing with 7. It's equal to 7. We either increment by 4 or we subtract 1. Finally, if it's high, we either increment by 1 or subtract 1, depending on whether the sum is greater than 7 or not. We then form the images, or rather, a more accurate way to say it is we form the images' names. All right? If you look here in the CSS_HTML, the images are in the folder images, and then we're filling in the value from the model. So what we should look for is a folder called images in the web server root, and D1 through D6 are the appropriate images for dice roll of 1 through 6. What's that little squiggle mean at the beginning? It means starting at the web server's root, right? So starting at the web server's root, we go down to the images folder and then look for the image that's properly there. How do we get the name of that image? Well, we concatenate the letter D, because those image names start with D, the number of the dice, which is in the variable D1, if you remember, and then we concatenate the value of .jpeg because these have a file extension of JPEG. All right, I then set the result class. All right, so initially when the page loads, that class was set the first time. Here I'm changing it to postback, so it's going to change the status to, or it's going to change the class to postback, which means that all this will be visible. And that's it. The model finishes executing. The Razor page then gets and plops in all these values from the model to complete sort of the template of the web page. In other words, when you look at this, your Razor page, your CISS_HTML page, simply put, is an HTML document with some blanks that get filled in by the model. All right. Now we could write some code on the CSS_HTML side as well. But as I mentioned, it's sort of good, you know, as a practice, if you have a choice, you want to put the code in the model. Any questions about this? Now, do we have a problem with validation? Well, let's see. It's a dropdown that has 3 values. So one of them is going to be selected, right? One of them is going to be selected. All right. So I cannot possibly have an empty value for this. So I really don't need to validate this. Now, this line here, should I validate that? That's one where you can stop and think for a minute, because the answer is not obvious. That, despite it coming from the form, request form, it's not coming as a result of user input, right? It's coming from a hidden form field, and we are controlling what goes into that form field, right? Now, because of that, if we did our work correctly, that should never not be a number. It should never not be a number. That being said, I might put a try-catch in here anyhow. Just on, I don't know, something I can't imagine. You know, a security issue or something like that. All right. So yeah, even though I've reasoned that that can't possibly be invalid, yeah, I might put a catch in there anyhow, try catch anyhow, just in case there's something I'm not thinking of. Any questions about this? Yeah. Right. Yes. If you use radio buttons instead of a drop down, it would depend on how you set it up initially. In other words, you could by default select one of the radio buttons, because and then you wouldn't need to validate, because once a radio button is selected, you can't unselect everything. But if you didn't want there to be a default and had an empty choice, then absolutely you would need to validate. The other way that you would need to validate is if I did one of those drop downs where the first option here was please make your choice. All right. Then I'd have to validate because they couldn't leave it at that value. I do want to remind you of a couple of things as we close today. First of all, this is your basic web server root directory. All right. And like CISS243, this would be the folder where you had all your files. You might have a subfolder called images, and you might have a subfolder called CSS, and so on. The only difference, and it's a big difference, is none of the web pages are in there. Why? Because the web pages aren't HTML. They're server-side code where the server has to process them in order to develop them. And those are not contained as part of the website. They're not contained as part of the files itself, I mean, are not part of the web server root. All right. There's probably a lot of reasons for that. A security reason would be one. You don't want to expose those files to potential misuse. Little tilde indicates the web server root, and then it's just like CISS216, how you would go down to the folder called images and then put the value in there. If I want to change the CSS, I can change this file, all right, which I did. I'm not sure I like that. I think in the other example I did last time, I created my own CSS file. The reason is because this CSS file, the first part of it, gets generated. And I might not want to mess with my own code in a file that got generated. I mean, it's not horrible, but just it doesn't cost any more to put a second CSS file. All right, so I might rather put these in their own CSS file. If I did that, be sure that the CSS file that you want to override everything is last. All right, because if there's things declared on the same level, they have the same selector, the last one wins. All right, now, I think I did this last time, and I think I gave a very quick explanation. Well, I want to do a little more thorough explanation today. Let's say I want to make the body of this page beige. All right. I noticed something. The background color of a good part of the page is beige, but not everything. We have this band up here that's not beige. Why not? I thought we said the last one wins. Why doesn't that body win and make everything on the page beige? I had this question from a student this week that was running into a problem like that. I don't remember which student, but the idea is like this. Remember how CSS works. All right, let's look at this, which contains the navigation on the top of the page. There's a whole bunch of classes associated with that navigation. If there's a style rule in my other style sheet files written to this class or one of these classes, then that's going to overrule the body because that selector is more specific. Remember that the more specific CSS rule, the more specific selector beats a more general selector. So if I give a style rule for navbar, for example, anywhere in there, that's going to override mine for body, even though mine's in the second CSS file and is at the very end. So let's take a look and see if we can see it. Not in this file. It must be in one of these files that it pulls, like from Bootstrap. Remember, you can't change this one because it has a URL. But we can certainly look it up. Oh, that's a minimized version of it. Minimize is where they get rid of all the spaces. Because remember, on a big site that is getting millions of requests, you can cut down each thing by, a certain number of bytes, that's really a big win. But it doesn't make it very readable. So they usually have a minimized and unminimized version. And sure enough, if we look through this long enough, I'll bet oh, we're not finding the nonsense I typed in, but you do the search here anyhow. Oh, no wonder that the menu is right behind it. I don't know if you can do a find. Oh, yeah, there we go. And there you go. There's the CSS class for that. All right. Any questions about any of this? All right. See you next week. Glad we don't have class Thursday, if the weather predictions are accurate.